Hello everyone, and welcome to the lecture on Victorian Medievalism. This week we're going to focus on a couple of poems that were part of the Victorian medieval project of writing and creating art that called back to the medieval era and using that particular time period as a point of escapism from contemporary Victorian culture. For Victorian writers and artists, medievalism was a type of fantasy. Looking back to the medieval era provided the illusion of a more uniform, stable culture than what Victorians were actually experiencing. They had a type of nostalgia for this more ordered life that they viewed as being simpler and easier. And whether or not that's true, as we'll discuss, actually kind of pushes the Victorian medieval movement into fantasy because it was a way to escape every day. Some of the qualities that the writers and painters really loved about this era were that they had these ideals of finding work that was really fulfilling and not mechanistic and industrialized, like what was happening with a lot of labor during the Victorian era. Also, the ideals of heroic achievement, that there were spiritual ideals that people could aim for and strive for that would make a person a better type of person. And also, seeing themselves as perhaps more integrated with nature. That civilization, again, with the Industrial Revolution, had become much more mechanized and much more dependent on factories and drawing people out of a natural environment where they're connected to the land. So there was this idealization of the medieval time period as embodying these types of qualities that Victorians felt were lacking in everyday life. Now, while this lecture is just going to mainly be looking at literature and art, I did want to point out a couple of pieces of information from the Victorian Web, which is a great resource if you want to learn more about some of the different movements that were happening during the 19th century. So I pulled a couple of quotes here. First, the medieval revival affected all aspects of Victorian life, including art and architecture, literature, philosophy, politics, and religion. So when we're talking about Victorian medievalism in this particular lecture, we're really focusing on just one part of what was a broader cultural movement during this time period. And as Victorian Web explains, this movement served as a mode of descent from the modern developments in the Victorian era, and I'll talk more about that in just a moment. And I also wanted to mention that although there had been medieval themes in earlier works, and I have the example of John Keats's La Belle Dame sans Merci, Victorians really responded in a more unified movement across the arts and used one another's medieval themes for inspiration. So it's not that medieval tropes or illusions did not exist prior to this movement, because they clearly were there. But when we get to this particular time in Victorian history, you have a much more cohesive movement that's happening across the arts and, as I mentioned, philosophy, politics, and religion as well. So it's pervasive throughout culture, and we're just going to be focusing on just writing and painting for this week. Now, because Victorian medievalism was such a pervasive movement, people understood and consciously chose to practice and participate in medievalism as an aesthetic point of view during that time period. This wasn't something that was labeled by later writers and readers, and then they said, we're going to look back and call this period medievalism. Instead, the people who were living through it consciously participated in it and chose whether or not they wanted to align themselves with medievalists. And people had pretty strong opinions about it as a general movement, and even especially some of the more famous writers, which I'll mention in just a moment, had strong opinions about whether or not people should be using medievalism in literature in particular. So I wanted to give you a couple of perspectives on this movement by categorizing this as a then versus now strategy. So the people on the left who were pro-medieval thought that it was good to look back to that time period because it provided some contrast from contemporary Victorian life that they felt were really important. First of all, in the arts and crafts movement, people like John Ruskin and William Morris really backed this idea that connecting a person to the work of their labor actually gave that labor much more meaning. So if I'm going to create a chair by hand, I will value that chair and I will understand the labor that went into it much more than if I had it produced through industry and a factory and I had no participation at all in the labor and in the crafting of that particular chair. So pro-medieval was much more about handmade things, arts and crafts movement. Con-medieval would be that the perspective that industrialization actually benefits society, that it's better for us to, and cheaper for people to produce things on a mass scale because it allows people to labor less, that they wouldn't have to spend all of their time making one chair, but they'd be able to purchase a cheaper chair and enjoy it and use that time somewhere else. So different perspectives, but the arts and crafts movement was aligned with the pro-medieval side. Next, the literary side, there was a pretty big split on how poetry should deal with medievalism. People like Swinburne, Tennyson, Morris, and Rossetti really felt like the poet in particular should focus on beauty and spiritual truth. So that when you read a poem, and you've read two for this week, what you'll see is a lot of beautiful imagery and an emphasis on, particularly in Morris's poem, The Defense of Guinevere, an emphasis on spiritual values and trying to discover if those spiritual truths are greater or more important than society's truths. For someone like Elizabeth Barrett Browning, however, she was against the medievalism movement. She thought that the poet should focus on the present age, meaning the Victorian world around them. And she even has a famous part of her long poem, epic novel poem, actually, Aurora Leigh, that talks about the medievalists in this kind of sarcastic tone and sort of makes fun of them and says, why are you looking back to the past? You should look out your window and write about what you see. There's enough food for poetry in the real world without us having to look out back to the past and pretend that our world doesn't exist anymore. So this was a fight amongst poets about what poetry should do. Should it be producing poems like The Lady of Shalat, where you're dealing with knights and curses and this sort of world that's gone by, or should you be looking out at the factories and writing about child labor and the problems of society and sort of that more heavy moralistic point of view in order to try to change the current society around them? And then finally, the novels also took two different directions. The novels were really being developed as one of the primary art forms of the 19th century, and writers like Sir Walter Scott were writing stories that looked back to the medieval times in order to inspire heroic values. But prominently, most novelists were really trying to provide that same sort of social commentary that Elizabeth Barrett Browning was saying poetry should do. People like Elizabeth Gaskell, Dickens, Trollope, and Eliot were all using the everyday society around them to talk about the world as it was, not as it was to them as contemporaries, not as it was in the past. So there was this kind of fight that was happening during the Victorian time period, and a lot of reviewers would review poetry and art by the Victorian medievalist writers and painters, and they saw it as being too juvenile. They saw them as being too escapist and really accused them of not engaging in the everyday world. So when you hear these things that I'm saying, escapist, everyday world, what should at this point in the semester be coming up in your mind is the idea of realism versus fantasy. At the heart of this debate is, how are we going to deal with what is real in front of us? How are we going to use our literature and our art? Are we going to have literature that takes us out of the world, or are we going to have literature that makes us engage with our current world? And they're just very divergent paths, and people had really strong opinions about this. So when you have this then versus now, we could almost replace those with fantasy versus realism across the top. So let's look at our first example with Tennyson's Lady of Shalott. Now, Tennyson is known for writing a long version of the Arthurian legends called the Idylls of the King. And he's using Arthurian legends, but he's also revising them to suit his needs. So if you're familiar with the actual original stories, Elaine of Astolat is taken by Tennyson and turned into the Lady of Shalott. So he's kind of changing her name and changing a little bit of the details, but overall keeping the same structure. So for Tennyson, he really felt that the use of these Arthurian legends was not just nostalgic. So contrary to what people were criticizing him for, he felt like using them was a way for him to comment on Victorian life and culture. And I'll talk more about that in just a little while. But for now, I want to give you some context that the poem is originally published in 1833 and it's revised in 1842. So I did post the two different versions for you to read. And mainly the reason I did that is for you to compare the two endings because they do change the agency of the lady and they can affect the meaning of the poem overall. And I'm going to talk more about that in just a moment, but make sure that you have looked at those two different endings on the second link that compares the two versions. And for now, what I would like us to do first is have some context about how this particular poem and Tennyson's poems in general worked within the broader Victorian cultural movement of medievalism. This poem especially inspired a lot of contemporary artists to illustrate medieval characters from the poetry, and so I've pulled a few different examples of that I want us to look at. The first image that I have here is Lancelot Looks on the Lady by Dante Gabriel Rossetti, and this was created in 1857. So the thing to know is that the poetry of John Keats and of Tennyson were really foundational for the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, which Rossetti formed. This particular brotherhood in the Victorian era was also its own separate movement of painters and artists who were really interested in art that was supposed to represent idealization, using both poetry and the visual arts. You'll see with Morris, he participated on both sides, to represent figures that were ideals of beauty and of spiritual truth. So there's a lot more detail that you can go into if you want to research the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. They have their own set of values and ideals, but just for our purposes now, I want to note that one of the things that they would do is actually look to medievalist literature and to the poetry of Tennyson and create artworks based on some of his characters. So here you have the conclusion of the poem, the second version in particular, where Lancelot is looking at the Lady of Shalott after she's floated down the river into Camelot. The next painting that we have here of the Lady of Shalott was done by John William Waterhouse in 1888. Now, Waterhouse was later in the century, but he did look back to Tennyson for inspiration and repainted this particular poem multiple times over his career, and I've got a couple more slides to show you some different versions that he did. And he also was a painter that embraced some of the values of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. So we don't have time to go into all the details and values of the Pre-Raphaelites, but one of the things that they wanted to do was have this tension between extreme amount of details. So you can look at this particular painting and think about all these details contrasted with these extreme beauty and extreme idealization of color and texture and form. So again, I hope you're seeing the same pattern here. You have this tension between the realistic detail and the idealization of the fantasy. So even in the artwork itself, you're seeing those things come out in the way that the Victorians were kind of struggling and making sense of the world through these two different extremes. So you can think about, if you look at it closely, you can see her name on the boat, as in the poem by Tennyson. You can see the tapestry that she has over the side of the boat. If you look very closely, you can see the knights that she's woven into the tapestry. So all these details are coming from Tennyson's poem, and Waterhouse was inspired by it and decided to paint this portrait of her. And the next couple of slides show a few of his other versions. Here's a slightly later one from 1894 where the Lady of Shalott has turned from her loom and turned from the mirror to look out the window. It's the moment of the curse. So if you look behind her, you can see the mirror where she has seen Lancelot. We're in the position of the window. So we're looking in on her through the window, and we can see her tapestry and her weaving behind her. And then in the very corner of the mirror, you can actually see Lancelot's helmet. So the idea is that he's riding along outside, and we're outside with him looking in towards her at that moment when she's spotted him in the mirror and she's turned, and the curse is about to fall on her. And here's the final one by Waterhouse, which was painted actually post-Victorian era in 1916. He's still working with the same poem by Tennyson. So, and this one is actually titled "I Am Half Sick of Shadows," a line from the poem. And you can see again the extreme details here that he's included in order to portray her, even though it's a fantasy. And you can see the bold colors, which he's also pulling from the Pre-Raphaelite movement. So all of these are showing this kind of evolution of his interest in Tennyson's poems over decades, and he's really kind of revisited this over and over again and painted her in different ways because he's so interested in this poem. So I wanted to present these for you as a way to show the impact of this movement, that it was actually a really big movement and that affected a lot of different artists and writers. The last image that I have here is actually a photograph. So photography was invented in 1826, and by the time this picture was taken in 1875 by Julia Margaret Cameron, it was very popular to recreate scenes from poems or from literature in types of dramatic stagings with costumes and with atmosphere. So what Cameron has done here is had her actor and actress recreate a moment from the poem, but you'll see here that she's using the original name. Instead of the Lady of Shalat, she has Elaine of Astolat and Elaine in the Barge as her title. So the barge being that moment where she's died and she's floating down the river. So she has still looked back to the Victorian medieval times, but she's recreated it in her own way, in her own interpretation of it in this photograph. So we'll look at a couple more of her photographs towards the end of this lecture as well to see some of the different ways that she recreated medievalism in her work. But for now, let's turn to the actual text of the poem by Tennyson and look at what's happening with some of the action. Let's take a look at the 1842 version of The Lady of Shalott. So first of all, the first thing to note is that we have another poem that's telling a story somewhat similar to The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, where you have characters and you have a plot of sorts, and you're going to have an introduction and a middle and a conclusion, so a narrative journey. And the action of the poem occurs with this type of movement as the stanzas progress, and you get more and more information about the Lady of Shalott as we go. Now, even though you have the poem telling a story, you also have a rhyme scheme that is very static. So if you look at the first stanza, for example, you have the rhyme scheme of lie, rye, sky, by, and then Camelot, go, blow, below, and then Shalott. So a static rhyme scheme of A, 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 B, C, 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 B. And then this is repeated in every stanza. So D, 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 B. E, 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 B, right? So you're always kind of coming back to that one line of Camelot and Shalott over and over again. And then you have these other rhymes that seem to be moving things forward, but also the constant repetition is really playing a role in the way that the poem is experienced aesthetically. And this tension between the movement of the narrative forward and the stasis that's heard in the sound of the lines is something that we should also tie to the theme or to the action of the poem. So the lady's position, trapped in the tower, is that stasis. She can't really break free of the rhyme. She's constantly kept in this tower wondering, can she move forward? Can anything really happen to her? And that repetition of the rhyme scheme is supposed to also mirror that sense of stasis that she's actually experiencing as well. I want to also mention that these fantasy elements like the curse and the imprisonment and the medieval setting that's being nostalgized are all just taken as part of the world, right? So the Lady of Shalott herself doesn't know what the curse is going to be, but she knows that the curse is real. And as we find out as the poem goes forward, the supernatural is real. It does happen. There's no uncanny explanation. There's no, oh, just kidding, this was actually a joke that someone was playing on her, or a riddle that had to be solved and the answer was something that is in the everyday. This poem is fully in the marvelous. in the terms that we've been learning this semester. So we don't really have to make a choice about what is real or what is not real. There's not a lot of suspense there from the fantastique. But we should also note that the fantasy is presented with some realistic elements to it. So it's supposed to be believable even though it's not the real world. And that's, details, for example, again, going back to that first stanza about the long fields of barley and of rye, the willows that are whitening, the aspens that are quivering in the second stanza, right? There's these realistic details about the trees and the landscape and the visuals that are being provided that give some grounding to the fantasy, even though ultimately the fantasy is what tends to dominate at the end because the curse comes true and the Lady of Shalott dies. So when we think about, comparing it back to the paintings that we just looked at, those realistic details that Waterhouse, for example, was putting in his paintings with the Lady of Shalott, this is the same tension, right? Grounding belief. How can we get the reader to believe in the world of fantasy? Well, we can give details. We can help people to picture this world so that it becomes realistic in the sense that it's imaginatively real. And think back to Coleridge, right? The willing suspension of disbelief needed to believe in a dramatic illusion. So being able to let go of criticism, let go of the need for realism, and be able to just focus on that fantasy element. That's what's important within the context of creating a believable fantasy, and that's what gives it a lot of its pleasure. So you'll remember from the action of the poem that the Lady of Shalott is weaving and seeing the world through a mirror. She can't look out the window or she will be cursed. And she doesn't know what the curse is, but she knows that if she turns and looks, then it will come upon her. So what happens? Inevitably, she sees Lancelot in the mirror. She turns and goes to the mirror, or to the window rather, to see him in person, and the curse comes upon her and the mirror cracks, and she has enough time to make her way down out of the tower to a boat where she writes her name on the side, and then she floats down the river. And then we have those two different endings. In the first ending, the earlier version, the lady writes her own words and speaks about herself on the parchment, asking people to draw near her and naming herself. And then in the revised version, Tennyson makes it more mysterious. He doesn't really give her that direct voice, and there's more questions. So if you're looking at the last stanza, who is this and what is here? And in the lighted palace near died the sound of royal cheer, because her boat has come down into Camelot. And they cross themselves for fear, all the knights at Camelot. But Lancelot mused a little space. He said, she has a lovely face. God in his mercy lend her grace, the Lady of Shalott. So everyone is kind of afraid of her because obviously they're in the middle of this big party and her body comes down the river in this boat and interrupts the party. And everyone's really afraid, but Lancelot, being the brave knight that he is able to approach her and see her and bless her. And that was the version that Tennyson ended up with. So there is a difference in our understanding of the poem based on the woman being able to say her own name and ask people to draw near her versus Lancelot becoming the central figure of the end of the poem because of his heroic stature, not being afraid, and kind of giving this priority to him over her. So that ending, I think people have criticized because they're not really sure why Tennyson would take away the lady's voice and end up giving that voice to Lancelot at the conclusion. As with any poem, there's a wide variety of interpretations of what the poem could mean, but of course we have to remember with fantasy, sometimes there isn't just a direct meaning, sometimes it's much more about just enjoying it aesthetically. If we are going to try to assign a meaning to the poem, the most popular one is that the lady is a metaphor for the poet or the artist. And typically the way the poem is read is that the isolation that she has at the beginning produces art. So she's weaving a tapestry, and that this is only able to be accomplished because she's in an isolated state where she looks at the world, but she's not really participating in it. And that subjective interpretation is part of the artistic process. So she's not seeing the world directly. She's seeing it through a mirror, which allows that sense of interpretation or the artist's perspective to become part of her tapestry. So she's not trying to reproduce it exactly as it is, but she's taking that reflected image and then creating it again in another layer removed from the real. So allowing her own interpretation into what she's creating. And then finally, the last kind of part of this interpretation that might work within the poem is that leaving the tower could symbolize a compromise of the artistic vision. So by entering society, what would happen to the artist is that the artistic part of the person dies. It leads to death, it leads to self-destruction, because that isolation is what is keeping art alive. It's what's producing that interpretation. It's what allows the artist or the poet to thrive. And that whenever the artist comes into contact with other people or becomes part of society, that unique perspective that's nurtured in isolation is compromised and destructs the person. So this is one version or interpretation of what the poem has meant to people in contemporary society. But in the actual Victorian time period, it could have been read in a variety of different ways, as being nostalgic or even as a commentary on the use of the loom that the lady is weaving on and how it is used as a one-to-one relationship. Again, think about the arts and crafts movement where she is producing her own work of art through her own labor, and that leaving that actually causes pain, right? So there's a different type of interpretation that's similar to the poet as, an artist metaphor, but it has more to do with labor and industry. So there's a wide variety of ways that you could read it, but most often people tend to read this poem for its beauty. It's been made into songs, it's been made into paintings, it's inspired a lot of other artists. So you can see how that sort of fantasy, nostalgic experience allows a type of escapism that's inspirational and doesn't necessarily have to have a direct meaning necessarily. Let's look at our second example, the Defense of Guinevere, first by looking at a painting painted by William Morris in 1858, who was also the author of the poem. So he's writing the poem and he's painting this portrait, so you can tell that he's very interested in this narrative, this medieval narrative of Guinevere, who you'll remember was married to King Arthur and then had an affair with Lancelot. So we can consider the two versions of the story together here. The sadness that we see in the painting where Guinevere is getting dressed after having the affair versus the defiance that you read about in the poem where she seems to feel no regret at all, really, and is defending herself. So there's two different ways that Morris is presenting her. And the painting has some of those same details that we've come to recognize now, the realism combined with the fantasy of the setting and the character. Most of the poem is a dramatic monologue spoken by Queen Guinevere. So she's been accused by Gawain of having an affair with Lancelot, and as we know, she is guilty. But the poem is basically trying to reveal her psychology to readers. So the dramatic monologue is a type of poem that's spoken in the voice of a character. So rather than just being a narrative poem like The Lady of Shalat, where it's telling a story, instead we are in a character's mind. So the majority of this poem, we do have a little context at the beginning and a couple of little asides that are not in her voice. But the majority of the poem is going to be in Guinevere's voice, spoken by her, and we're listening to her speak and listening to this appeal that she's making to her accusers. So this appeal is an appeal to power, to the power of her beauty, to the power of Lancelot's ability to defend her honor. And what's going to happen is that we're going to see values here that are in conflict with the contemporary Victorian world that Morris is writing in. So the poem is going to be promoting the idea that spiritual love intersects with sexual desire, and that this spiritual love is right even if it's condemned by society. So this is really quite a sharp critique of Victorian culture, which was very guided by extremely strict rules and very repressed in terms of sexuality. So people did, of course, have affairs, but they would never publicly defend their right to do so. And that's what we have here with Guinevere's defense, is that she is actually speaking this defense publicly in order to justify the love that she and Lancelot share, and that it's been expressed sexually, but it's a spiritual love, and it's supposed to contrast with these claims of innocence and beauty and these things that are supposed to be pure and untouched by sexuality. And what you see is Guinevere combining the two of them and saying that sexual love and spiritual love are okay, that they should be acceptable, and that she shouldn't be judged for these things. And she really asks this question about what is right, a couple of stanzas in, and she's saying here, God, what I ought to say, I have done ill, and pray you all forgiveness heartily, because you must be right, such great lords. Still, listen, suppose your time were come to die, and you were quite alone and very weak, yea, laid a dying, while very mightily the wind was ruffling up the narrow streak of river through your broad lands running well. Suppose a hush should come, then someone speak. And this voice is what she's imagining speaking to her. One of these cloths is heaven, and one is hell. Now choose one cloth forever. Which they be, I will not tell you. You must somehow tell of your own strength and mightiness. Here, see. So she's giving this example to her accusers. Yea, yea, my lord, and you to ope your eyes at your foot of your familiar bed to see a great God's angel standing with such dyes not known on earth, on his great wings and hands held out two ways, light from the inner skies showing him well and making his commands seem to be God's commands. So she's saying, imagine that you hear this voice, and then you open your eyes, and at the foot of your bed, an angel is standing with two different colors of cloth outstretched in his arms. And it seems like what he's saying is what God would tell you. So he's holding this cloth on his hands, and one of these strange choosing cloths was blue, wavy and long, and one cut short and red. No man could tell the better of the two. After a shivering half hour, you said, God help heaven's color, the blue. And he said, hell. So she's saying, you don't know how to choose which one is right, and you choose one, and the angel tells you you've chosen hell. Perhaps you would then roll upon your bed and cry to all good men that you loved well. Ah, Christ, if only I had known. Lancelot went away, then I could tell. So this is all an extended metaphor for her decision to have the affair with Lancelot. That in the moment it seemed to her that she was choosing heaven, that it was a choice of rightness because of that spiritual love that they shared between them. And then when he went away, after they had the sexual part of their affair, then she realized it was a mistake. But in the moment, she's saying that that sexual desire and that spiritual love were pure, that it was something that she chose, trying to choose what she thought was good. So this is one of her arguments. And again, we're seeing the movement of her mind, the way that she is trying to persuade people. How is she trying to appeal to her choice to have this affair? It's that I was choosing what was good. And, it seems pretty, maybe not that earth-shattering to us as contemporary readers, but in the time period, this would be a very sharp critique of Victorian culture and their approach to sexuality. So this is something that Morris is foregrounding as part of Guinevere's defense. And that in this way, in this particular poem, we do have a critique of society even at the same time that we're having it placed in a fantasy poem, that there is that escape or that way that it's not really critiquing actual Victorian people and practices. It's put back on Guinevere and on Lancelot to do the defending of this practice rather than directly commenting on Victorian culture. So I think that we have to consider that this poem has less emphasis on that fantasy side of the medieval because it's doing something different than what the Lady of Shalott is doing. There are no curses, there's no overt supernaturalness here. Instead, the fantasy comes in through the setting, that the setting is not realistic, it's not everyday, and really changing that setting allows Morris the ability to question Victorian values. If he's criticized for this, he can just point out that, hey, it's just a character, right? This is just Guinevere speaking. I wasn't really saying anything about Victorian culture. It's just an old story, and I was just trying to imagine the character of Guinevere and what she might have said. So there's a little bit of an out for him. There's an escape for him to be able to offer a criticism that directly comments on Victorian society, but not to necessarily do it in a way that would get him in a lot of trouble. So he's able to walk that line, if you will, between real criticism and then just saying it's all a fantasy. So essentially what happens as you go throughout the long poem is that Guinevere is going to defend herself by telling these different stories of different moments in her relationship, and she's going to talk until Lancelot arrives at the end of the poem to defend her by fighting for her honor. So again, the poem is ending with Lancelot. Again, we're kind of having the female voice be downgraded in favor of either Lancelot speaking in the case of the Lady of Shalat or Lancelot fighting in the case of the defense of Guinevere. Again, these are medieval values that were also positioned in a way that was positive in terms of Victorian culture, where, as we've mentioned before, the men were supposed to be the primary ones outside the home in the public sphere, the women in the domestic sphere. So you can see how that value is also shaping some of the action of the poem. The final thing that I wanted to mention about the poem is that we can see the influence of novels as a genre and their popularity in the Victorian time period. So we do have a first-person perspective here. We have interiority of a character, and this was not typically the case. Usually you're going to have the lyric eye of the poet. The eye of a character's perspective now becomes more primary than the lyric eye of a poet as the speaker. So there is a shift happening here in terms of form, as well as kind of the broader cultural implications of how Victorian medievalism is functioning in the culture. As we finish up the lecture, I just wanted to share a couple more photographs by Julia Margaret Cameron that are using some of the medieval imagery that we've been looking at this week. So you have here a couple on the passing of King Arthur. Here are two more. The left one is called The Parting of Lancelot and Guinevere. So again, thinking about how different artists are inspired by the same stories. And then the final one, not a medieval image, but still a very striking one, a portrait of how Cameron imagined the character of Ophelia. So as we finish up, I just want to bring to your attention a few of the major points from the Victorian Medievalism lecture so that you can focus on these and think about these going forward. So if we're thinking about the pleasure of medievalism, one of the main things would be that the medieval world allows authors to escape the complexities of changing Victorian culture. So the 19th century had a lot going on. Starts out with revolution and ideas of government overthrow. There's lots of reform in the early Romantic era in terms of legal reform. You have changes in the status of marriages and divorces. There's changes in scientific thinking and terms of how old the earth is, changes in industrial revolution and how technology and industry are impacting people's lives. It's just a huge shift in the way that people are living and working and thinking. So there's a lot of anxiety. And invoking the medieval world allows people to escape that anxiety and to just live in a place that can be sort of nostalgic for them in terms of things being simpler. So there's this fantasy that emerges through the idealization, and that pleasure comes from this fantasy of thinking that things were just simpler back then in the medieval time period. And of course, the medieval world that's being created in these paintings and in these poems is not a world that is going to prioritize realism. It is a form of fantasy because they're not addressing any actual problems from the medieval time period, like, for example, the plague, the lack of medical care. There was no real sanitation. But what happens is that we're able to blend a little bit of critique and realism through things like the details in the paintings that we talked about, in the descriptions of the landscapes and the poetry that we looked at with the Lady of Shalott, and the way that for example, Morris brought in social critique. So it can be implied and addressing some of these anxieties and some things that have to do with realism, even though it's not done so overtly. I also want you to remember that in Todorov's terms, Victorian medievalism would be considered marvelous. So the supernatural in The Lady of Shalott, for example, is not questioned. It's never shown to be false. There's no uncanny explanations. So the curse is real, and we really have a supernatural thing happening here. So what happens then is that you have this other world that's removed from ours. And because of that, medievalism often lacks direct social critique. And that is a common complaint that is made about a lot of fantasy literature today. That's too escapist, that it's not realistic enough in terms of the problems of the real world, and that this is why it's less important or less valuable. This kind of critique is exactly what writers faced during the 19th century. So nothing has really changed in terms of how people are valuing fantasy in that time period. So just keep these things in mind going forward as we continue to look at different manifestations of realism in fantasy. Thanks.